6. So thank you guys for coming. I'm going to move closer to you. Otherwise, I'm standing way up aside from everything. Can you guys see the little board up there? Oh, it's also up on the sides. Okay, good. All right, so you have 3 different places to look. We have a limited number of slides to go through, just covering the broad strokes of what's happened. So if you have any other topics you want to make sure that I hit, I'd be happy to do that, and then we'll leave ample time at the end for Q&A. If there is a specific topic you want me to hit, you can raise your hand now, and I can make sure to try and go more in depth on it when we get to it. Nothing yet? Anybody? Sure.
I mean, I'll say one topic that you're hearing lately is that they want to move the primaries, whatever, up until whatever, for the primaries like governor and states, whatever, up until April. I don't think that should be done.
Oh, right. I haven't heard of that.
I mean, we already have enough elections.
Yeah.
The last thing we need is keeping them in August is perfect. The last thing we need is another 4 months of the general election campaign for governor and U.S. senator.
Of the general? Okay. Yeah, I don't have that in my slides. Yeah, we can absolutely talk about that more. Any other topics you guys want to make sure we hit? Yes.
Yeah, the big investigation into the election ballot.
Yes, the Gableman stuff.
Yeah,
Yep.
the Gableman
Okay,
stuff.
we can make sure that's in there. That's in there. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Okay. So I should start by introducing myself. I'm Chris Larson. I'm your state senator. If you are not here expecting me, you're probably in the wrong place. But you are welcome to stay, even if it is a delightful surprise. I am your state senator representing Oak Creek, a bit of Franklin, South Milwaukee, Cudahy, St. Francis, Bayview, and then the east part of downtown, and then the east side around UW-Milwaukee. So this is the 4th of the 4 town halls we've been doing. You probably found out about it either on social media or through our newsletter that went out. I'd like to just try to give a perspective of where we are in the year, too. So as you may know, we go on a biennium at the state, which means we start right at the beginning of January in odd-numbered years, and then it goes until 2 years after that. The first 6 months are when we are working on the budget. The budget has to be passed by the end of June in odd-numbered years, so that was done just a little under a year ago. And then there's a fall session, and then there's a spring session, and then after that, they gavel to a close, and we are done for the year. That happened sooner than normal. We were finished in March, so the last 2 months we have had very limited committee meetings. There's one committee that I'm on that's called the Joint Committee for Review of Administrative Rules that we meet every once in a while to review rules. The Joint Finance Committee meets regularly, and they still pass things that have the rule of law dealing with budgets of how to expend money. But beyond that, we're pretty much done. So we're in a time, so as you hear me talking about things in the past tense and not the present tense, that's why. So after that last gavel, all the bills are dead. The actual final review of possible vetoes is tomorrow, and there's not really any indication that any vetoes will be coming up for an override. So that concludes where things are for the entirety of the biennium. What is happening is the elections are going on, and then the new legislature will be coming in January of 2023. So that kind of gives you a perspective about where we are in the process. So let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's happened. The big, in addition to the budget passing, a big tranche of funds came through from the federal government to deal with COVID. A lot of that went to the governor in the way that it was allocated, that he had sole discretion about how it was spent, which is not how it's normally done. Usually it goes through the legislature, it goes through joint finance, but this is a lesson learned after the ACA passed however many years ago, where they realized that things like the Medicaid expansion had to be approved by the legislature, and because they didn't approve it, Wisconsin is one of those last states that doesn't have it. So as you can see, they said the governor is going to expend a lot of this money on their own. So if you can see this white on yellow, which is a little bit tough with the light, but we had $4.5 billion available that was spent. $1 billion went to small businesses, farmers, tourism, lodging, and entertainment. 100+ million went on efforts to expand high-speed internet, which is a huge priority, not so much for us here in Oak Creek, but for the rest of the state, which continues to be lagging behind, literally lagging behind. So that was something that became very evident as students were at home learning. And then also increasing resources for the 1,900 nonprofits serving Wisconsin communities across the state. So how does that look? Sometimes you get all these big numbers and it's hard to conceptualize exactly what that looks like. So here's what it looks like for Milwaukee County. As you can see, it's about $70 million that were spent. And you can see the different breakdown of those. Big routes to recovery is a big one. The Wisconsin Rental Assistance Program is huge, especially for those who are on the edge of eviction. And then, of course, things that are very specific to the pandemic: contact tracing, testing coordination, pandemic plan allocation. So all of these things were part of how money was spent. But if you want to get really specific about some of the things that you can actually see in here of how things were spent, we can go to the next slide. And you'll see, so who here has been to our zoo ever? Okay, so the penguins, if you remember the penguins, they were at risk that the penguins were not going to stay there because their habitat needed rehabilitation. Some of the funds went to making sure that that was restored. So when you go there and you see that restoration happening, those are from recovery funds. Who's passed the Home Bridge lately and seen the one of the big tourist ships coming through, if you're heading that way? Well, $3.5 million went into increasing the port's cruise ship capacity, which you might think, well, that doesn't affect you. Well, with 33 port calls, each of them bringing in tons of money, and a total of about 10,000 people coming into our community, this is huge, a huge boon for tourism for us. So this is something where Milwaukee has a reputation as being a little bit lower cost than some of our neighboring communities like Chicago. So this ends up helping and bringing people in with a lot of the tourism that's happening around here. So that's some of the funds that came in and how it was spent. Going to the next slide. So these are things that I had proposed over the last 2 years. One of them, and again, just before you get your hopes up, these are things that did not pass, but these are things that helped move the conversation forward. One of them was the Public Education Reinvestment Act, or PERA, which would lower classroom sizes because lowering classroom sizes tends to focus the attention on individual students and has better outcomes. So this is something that would shift funds away from a program that has not worked, the voucher program, which has been an experiment that's been going now for 33 years and has not shown better results than our public school system, and yet over $2 billion have been spent on it. So this would phase that out and phase in what we know actually works. Another bill that I'm proud of is the Healthy School Meals piece of legislation, which would expand free breakfast and lunch programs to every child in our state. Oak Creek is one of the school districts that already has this expanded, but across the state there are some that don't. This was expanded throughout the pandemic by federal dollars because, as we all know from personal experience, when you have a good breakfast and you have a good lunch, you end up performing better as a human being. That is true for small people as well as large people. So this makes sure that they are fed, whether they come from a house that is full of food or they come from a family that does not have that. This also reduces the stigma, where right now you have students who will not be allowed to advance if they have school debt on their food card. So it reduces that, and it reduces the stigma associated with having to punch in a code. So everybody has it, everyone is treated the same, and it reduces that. If you think that doesn't happen, it's been a long time since you were a kid. So this helps make it a little bit easier for all of our little people. Teaching is a profession. This was something that was a long time coming. There's an 8-piece legislative package that I wrote and was co-sponsored by a lot of other legislators. We have seen an exit of a lot of professional educators, unfortunately, and that's for a variety of reasons, from unpredictable pay to them having to pay for their last semester when they are going on to be a teacher. at the same time as they're supposed to forego employment on their own. So that and a reduction in what they have access to in terms of health care and continued public attacks on their profession. So these 8 pieces would address all of those, setting everything from a minimum pay for starting teachers across the state, which would actually be pegged to what legislators make. Right now, the average, it varies, has a $10,000 range, but the average is about $34,000 annually that teachers make their first year teaching. It would also give a predictable pay schedule for how long they are working, including a bonus every 5 years, so that they stay within a school district and they stay on schedule. And predictable pay if they have higher education, if they go to get an advanced degree, right? Right now, if they get that, they basically get an attaboy, right? They might get something from their school district, they might not. And so there is wide gaps in terms of what people are paid based off of where they were teaching before, as school districts are scrambling just to be able to fill spots. And unfortunately, we're moving in the opposite direction, where the last education piece of legislation that was signed into law actually reduces the qualification for teachers so that you can be a substitute teacher simply if you are enrolled to become a teacher. So, at first semester, no classroom experience, and the idea was, well, they have the intent, they have the heart to become a teacher, and so therefore that is enough. Which is, why don't we pay teachers to be teachers instead of paying people and saying that they're teachers? So this is something we've been dealing with, and that's gotten a lot of attention. Hopefully it's picking up steam and getting some of the school districts to perk up and understand what, they already know what's going on, but to try and push their legislators for what needs to happen. And just to be clear, this is in contrast to the next slide, which is what the attacks were on public education. So the stuff that I talked about is the stuff that didn't pass. This is stuff that did pass the legislature, but as you can see by the big red stamp in the corner, it was vetoed. And so that includes the breakup of Milwaukee Public Schools. And you may not have a connection to Milwaukee Public Schools, being down here in Oak Creek, but recognize that most of the pieces of legislation that hit Milwaukee very quickly expand to other parts of the state. And this one did not allocate in a single extra dollar for the schools. It would just break them up into 4 to 8 new school districts, which is not proven to work, and in fact would end up being more expensive because you'd have duplication of a lot of executive posts. And on top of that, it would hyper-segregate an already segregated city, because how would you divide these districts? Well, it would probably be by geography. Well, if you know any history about Milwaukee, you know that the geography is based off of what happened with redlining and would become a huge problem. So, so that was something that was passed and unfortunately was vetoed. There was a full expansion of voucher program. As I mentioned before, this is an experiment that has not worked. It does not produce better outcomes empirically. It was originally started as an intention to say that low-income students would be able to go to private schools, and that would be paid for by the public, and say, we're giving those kids an opportunity that they wouldn't otherwise have. Well, the farce was revealed on that one 10 years ago when they increased the income levels to triple the poverty level. And what that turned out was the next group of people who ended up collecting voucher money, 77% of those students were already enrolled in the private school the prior year. So it was just a subsidy for 77% of those students and their parents who were already attending it. Yep.
On that point, whenever I had a follow-up question.
Sure.
How do you respond, because I asked this same question whenever Representative Rodriguez at her similar forum, whatever she did about a month ago.
Yeah.
Whatever I asked, my issue, whatever was, is that I look at my property tax bill in South Milwaukee, and there's a line item on there, I think it says like $450,000, whatever went to the voucher and choice program.
Right, it's an insert. That's not on the bill, but yeah, it's an insert that's in your bill. Yep.
So whenever I asked her, I'm like, how do you justify that? Her response back was that the school district of Cudahy, South Milwaukee, Oak Creek, whatever, that their revenue numbers per student, so i.e. their whatever, so in school funding revenues cost, difference, others say whatever, whatever. And she just said, she really had no response to that topic, other than to say whatever that the cost of she said that the cost of educating public school student, whatever is 16. She wrote a number between 15 and 17,000 depending on the district, versus the funds that are taken away, whatever, if they go to student open enroll, student voucher charter, whatever, is between 8 and 10. And she said the number is 8. It's a legislative. So how do you
Right.
respond to how do you respond to that?
Yep.
How do you respond to that topic?
That's a good question, and that is one of them that they fall back on. They don't really, you don't end up hearing, does anyone understand the question that he asked? It's about, there is a advocacy for voucher schools saying that, it costs less. It costs less per student than what's happening in a school district. And that is empirically true, but you have to dive into the numbers to understand what's really going on. And it's basically the last thing that they can fall on. The outcomes, the educational outcomes, no different. You know, study after study. The closest one that's been pointed out was one out of Arkansas that was commissioned by the Walton family 10 years ago, where they didn't have enough data, but they ended up cherry picking what they wanted. And even that one, I think it was only 2 subjects in 1 grade that they said, they perform better in English and math from 3rd to 4th grade. But if you dug down to the data, they weren't actually following enough students because students kept moving to different schools. And so what they fall back on is saying, it's cheaper. What's happening, and this is true, is that they end up, it's like a game of pickup basketball where they get to choose whatever students they want to teach. And so what happens, for example, is, let's say MPS is for an example. The number of students who need special attention, who have an individualized education program, IEP, is 20.5%. And if you look at most voucher schools, private schools, it is almost always less than half that. And so what happens is when a student comes in and they need more attention, they need more individualized attention from teachers, they need, what happens is those private schools that receive vouchers will keep them until the 3rd Friday. What happens on the 3rd Friday, does anybody know this? That's when they do the attendance. And they do attendance every day, but that's the only one that matters by the way the state law is written. And so what happens that day is they say, these are the number of students for your formula. After that, the Monday after, which unfortunately a lot of other schools call the dump day, is the day that those students find their way into public schools without a single penny following them. So they get pushed out, and I have heard from dozens of people who have both worked in public schools and in private schools where they say, how are we going to deal with, and if they're in the private school that's receiving the voucher, they'll say, how are we going to deal with so-and-so, this person is falling behind. They say, well, just keep them in the room, keep them entertained, give them snacks, let them color, let them do what they want until that 3rd Friday. And after that, they're not a problem anymore. Then they get the check. And so that ends up culminating, and then the school district that has to absorb them has to pick up every cost to try and get that student. Because private schools have the ability to reject students. Public schools do not because of the state mandate that every child must be in school. So that's what's happening with the lower cost versus higher cost. Becomes a heck of a lot easier. So the way that I think about it is a pickup game of basketball where one captain gets to choose whoever they want. And then at any point throughout the game, they can continue to choose people from the other team, whereas the other team, the other captain, has to take everyone who's left. And what's remarkable is that they're performing the same. So even in that system, they're performing the same. They're performing no better. So there's a lot of, what it does do is it creates a divided system where you're actually spending on 2 parallel school districts. And I guess if you add them up, it would actually be more than 2 because you have the public school district, you have the private voucher school program, and you have one that is the private charter program, and then there's one other one. So you have 4 different school districts that the state is spending money on to try and educate kids, and while we're doing that, we're not doing anything successfully. It's just dividing the pie up further and further and further. It is the largest expense for our state. It's the biggest expense for the state. And you can look at the numbers and kind of get, gobsmacked looking at it. But the reality is we continue to fall in numbers in terms of where we are spending per pupil on a per pupil basis. So we're in the lower half. And we have not recovered from the largest cut to K-12 education that came 10 years ago, 11 years ago now. So that's what's going on. Yeah. The other big one that you might not have heard of, because the other two that I had mentioned, there was probably some attention in the news that you might have caught. What you might not have seen is the AB 963, which was something that projected to set up something called the Bill of Rights, Parents' Bill of Rights. Now, what's interesting about that is, again, this only applied to public school parents, not private school parents. Private school parents were supposed to forego their so-called rights. But what happened in public schools is that a parent could get access to the entire curriculum for the school, which sounds okay. That's something you have access to as a parent already. But what could happen is if they deviated from that in any way, that parent could sue the school district for monetary damages, to sue for money. In addition, the parent could end up going through almost as like a menu and going through the entire curriculum and saying, I want my kid to be taught this, 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 but not this, but not this, but not this, on a daily basis, which would make it impossible for any teacher to be able to go through and teach an instruction, especially if they're going through and trying to say, okay, I'm supposed to teach this, this, and this to this kid, and then do the same thing and try to go through the entire classroom of 25, 30, 35 students. And again, just for public schools. Private schools, doesn't matter, you can teach them whatever you want, and parents don't get to find out, which is the case now. And again, for monetary damages. So what this would do is it would empower those parents, those folks who have been showing up at school districts with the loudest voices, screaming about books or screaming about things that they didn't like as part of the curriculum. And granted, that, as much as that might get a little bit messy, that is the public process, that is the democratic process, where you can go, you can take a vote, you can decide on who's going to be in charge of the school board, and they move from there. This would allow any fringe minority to be in charge of what happens and is going through a curriculum on a classroom by classroom basis. In the debate on this, there's people who are coming up and saying this is why we need a camera in every classroom, and we need to monitor every teacher on everything that they're doing, and if they vary from it, they should be fired and sued. Very extreme stuff, very extreme stuff. Yeah, exactly. When we're not paying teachers enough, this is how we would treat them, to say that we're not trusting anything that they're doing within it. So, and again, teaching pieces of history or teaching things that are part of a normal curriculum that might not feel comfortable would be things that they could get pulled out for. So, fortunately, that was vetoed, and this is these are pieces that are not unique. This is part of a national trend to try and dumb down what's happening in our public schools. So, other notable things, there was an attack on transgender students that was also vetoed. There was a further attempt to hyper-scrutinize the report cards that was vetoed, and then lowering the sub-teacher standards, which that one did get signed. That was signed, yeah. So, I know, I'm not happy about it, but yeah. But yeah, as I said, that one we've moved to the point where the school districts are starving for teachers. So if you ever want to sub, they need them. They need people in schools, unfortunately, because they don't have the pay to be able to cover them. So moving on, polyfluoroalkylides, PFAS. Who knows what PFAS are? Have some idea. Okay, so if you don't know, the first thing you should know is that you have PFAS in you right now. Surprise, hooray. Every single human being on the planet has PFAS in them. PFAS are permanent man-made chemicals that come on everything from Teflon pans to plastic coating. The ones that really got attention this cycle were the PFAS that come from firefighting foam. A lot of the testing was done up in Marinette, Wisconsin, and there was an attempt to try and set the standard of how much PFAS would be acceptable in groundwater. Again, knowing that unfortunately PFAS are basically everywhere. There was a push to try and say that we would have a set standard of 20 parts per trillion. Unfortunately, the DNR came back and said 70 parts per trillion would be allowed as far as contaminants would go. So this is a huge setback, unfortunately. to what is allowable in our groundwater. So for those of you that do know PFAS, I did a special town hall on this, my gosh, a million years ago, 2 years ago? 2 years ago we did one where we dove and we brought in experts about what's going on with this. Unfortunately, Wisconsin is very, very far behind on what's happening with not allowing PFAS contamination. But on the good news side of things, we don't have a slide for this, but on the good news side of things, Attorney General Call is going after the source company that started a lot of this up in Marinette. On the good news side, further good news side of things, on the next slide, we do have lower, oh, you switched it. You just changed the slides. You changed the slides, okay. So on the good news side of things, $600,000 became available for municipalities to test their water. If you have questions about where we are, we don't have info on where Oak Creek's water is, I take it? Okay, so we're not tested. So we're living in the unknown. But if you do have questions about it, you can call that number at the Oak Creek Water Utility. But there was some contamination that happened at Mitchell Airport. Any place that they're doing firefighting drills, where it runs off into the water supply, you have a higher than normal contamination rate on that. Okay, some bills we introduced, we can skip that. New district maps, this is something we got a lot of questions on about what the maps look like. So if you look at the yellow, that's the 7th Senate District. You can spot where you live in there and see where you are. This shifted a lot. The big breakdown on this is that, as you can see, early March, the Supreme Court adopted Governor Evers' maps based on a new standard of least change. Did you guys hear about the least change thing? So that's something that's new for Wisconsin. It's not done in any other state or jurisdiction, but because of that, Governor Evers submitted these maps that were chosen and saying, okay, this abides by the least change standard, which literally in its construction, in its manifestation as a new standard, was built as an incumbency protection program, which is something they explicitly stated because they were saying, oh, it's really hard for people to learn their new legislators. I don't think that's how we should be doing it. I don't think legislative incumbency should be taken into consideration at all, as much as I enjoy representing you. You know, if somebody's doing a lousy job, vote them out, you know? And incumbents already have a pretty decent chance of getting reelected. But that was something they created out of whole cloth. And we know that's the case because they sure as heck didn't consider it 10 years beforehand when they drew the current maps that they were going off of. In fact, in that case, they had shifted all kinds of lines and moved people right out of their districts. So anyways, the state Supreme Court adopted that. Unfortunately, later that month, the US Supreme Court ruled, it says against the maps, but it didn't actually say that it was against what it was stating it was against. So it said that there's a possible violation of the Voting Rights Act because they may have unduly considered race as the maps were drawn. Now, if you're wondering what that means in Milwaukee, where there were currently 6 minority majority districts, the Evers maps expanded that number from 6 to 7. And they're saying, you were taking race into consideration, and you possibly violated this. They kicked it back to the state Supreme Court and saying, look at it again or justify it. They could have actually chosen the same maps and said, no, we think we checked that out and it's okay. Unfortunately, bowing to political pressure, the justice that originally sided with the Evers maps on least change changed his mind, which is something that shouldn't happen in a court, especially considering there was literally 0 new evidence brought forward. He changed his vote. This decision came down April 15th, which happens to be the day that signatures start, elections officially start in the state of Wisconsin. And what that meant was that there was no possibility of redress this cycle. It means these are the maps regardless. And what's really insulting about that is, like I said, there is 6 minority majority districts in Milwaukee. This actually reduced it down to 5. So whereas the US Supreme Court said that you were taking race into consideration in an unfair way, this actually decided, we're going to be racially blind, but at the same time we're condensing and pushing more people into smaller districts, which should be facially unlawful. Yep.
What didn't make sense there was that you have minority population increasing, so they were given a boost, whatever, and
Yeah.
Evers maps, and then they went back to the legislative map, whatever that quote increased the compacting concept.
Yeah, of packing them even more. Packing and, yeah, packing, yep. Yeah, no, it doesn't make sense, but unfortunately the opportunity for redress is passed. So these are the maps that we are on, so that's what they look like right now. If you want detailed ones, Journal Sentinel has a pretty good website that you can go and see exactly how the lines changed. For the most part, ours are 95% the same. If you're interested, now you guys are paired up a little bit more with Franklin, so it used to just be this little bump, but now we go all the way out to 68th Street. So we have to think about doing stuff in Franklin a little bit more. Oh, we already do. So there you go. Any questions about the maps or PFAS or anything education that we covered so far? Okay. All right. I always like graphs because they demonstrate exactly where we are. And they give good visual representation. So as you can see, the yellow is the number of bills that were proposed this cycle, about 4,500. The ones that actually got enacted into law is the green at 266. And the vetoed one is that red sliver, 126. So about a third of those that passed were actually vetoed, which is, I think, setting the highest number that were vetoed in the last 40 years. Is it ever? Highest ever recorded. Highest number of bills vetoed that are ever recorded. And you can see how that breaks down. The top is the Senate right here. The bottom is the Assembly of how those are broken apart. Some of the numbers, just so we're not trying to deceive you with them, some of these are duplicate, so they have matching ones in the Senate, matching ones in the Assembly. So they're not completely double. So it's not actually 4,523 unique bills. There's a lot of overlap proposed in the Senate and the Assembly, if you remember your schoolhouse rocks and how that all works. So there you go. So there's a huge divide, unfortunately, of a lot of things. This doesn't sell this tells a lot of the picture, which is a lot of these bills never get a hearing, they never have a discussion, and so some of the biggest problems that we are facing, we have very little discussion on. And so what does that look like? That means we have had, I think, no significant bills dealing with the massive addiction and overdoses that are happening across the state. That means we have not had things dealing with gun violence, which is something that obviously is in the news right now. And there are other issues that we are just completely whistling past without actually addressing. So.
Would you say that's because it appears to me that you haven't been in session that much?
Yeah. So last time we set a record for how little we actually met. This time, so it's a hard record to beat. We met a little bit more than that, but yeah, it's pretty low, the number of times we're actually in session. Yeah, it is. We're the, yeah, I know. I am with you. I am with you 100%.
I don't understand why the other people in the other party don't feel like they're not being served.
Yeah, there is, and there's a lot of answers for that. One of the basic ones that's really frustrating is they don't want to give victories to the governor. They'd rather have it just be one side that gets it. So to give you an example, there was a bill that would have passed that would have put forward money to identify the remains of missing in action soldiers that passed unanimously. In the Senate, it's something that got stalled in the Assembly, and the reason they stalled it and killed it is because they said, we don't want to give the governor a victory on this one when we can have a Republican move forward and pass. Yes.
Whatever, I can't remember who's the Monday before, but it's common sense, everybody supports it, whatever, yet it's all the same.
Yeah, that was something I co-wrote and introduced before the pandemic, and we said, hey, we should move this thing forward. And what that would do is right now, as you may or may not know, ballots, when you vote absentee, the ballot doesn't actually get counted. It gets thrown in a big pile. So if you ever vote, raise your hand if you've ever voted absentee in the state of Wisconsin. So what happens is you fill out that envelope, and you ever notice, it goes in an envelope and then it's mailed. And whether you mail it or not, it goes in an envelope that could be mailed. The reason it is because that ballot cannot legally be counted in the state of Wisconsin until election day. And so what happens is they have to wait on it, and so sometimes they'll push through the ballots in the middle of the day. If it's a smaller community, I think Oak Creek does it that way. In Milwaukee, they actually have so many that they have a separate off-site facility that goes through these and processes them the entire day, but they cannot start until polls open. We've had a piece of legislation that would say, yeah, you can start counting before. It doesn't make any sense, and you can keep that number under a lid to be able to say, okay, this number can't be released. But that's what's happened when you see the numbers come in late. It's not that those numbers are coming in, that those votes are coming in any later. It's that they cannot release those numbers until all the numbers are counted by law. So, yeah, we've had bipartisan efforts to try and do that, but they've decided not to move forward on it because they actually, I don't want to say all of them, but there are some who like the idea of saying, aha, look at these numbers coming in late. They're up to something. And it's like, no, that you literally know exactly what's going on. In fact, you know, to call out one person in particular, Ron Johnson actually said that we should be counting the ballots early, and then he was one who was saying, oh, there's hanky-panky going on because all these numbers came in late. What's actually going on here? And he knows. He's on record. We have it on camera. But yeah, those are things that should be bipartisan. There's a lot of easy stuff that we should be able to just push through. Drunk driving is one, for goodness sake, that I am pushing every cycle. What's that? The yellow part is way too big. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And at the very least of having hearings to be able to talk about some of these things, yeah, would be good. But that does not, unfortunately happen.
Why does the state of Wisconsin issue them paychecks? They're not doing their job.
Yeah. I mean, this is the problem with when you have gerrymandered, when you have gerrymandered districts. So just to give you an idea of what that means after these new maps move forward, we have a very close state, 50-50, right? One of the closest in the country. And so when we have a 50-50 election, what that means and why this is happening, 50-50 election, top of the ticket, will give 62% of the seats to Republicans in the Assembly and 66% of the seats to Republicans in the Senate. 50-50 election. To actually have a 50-50 representation in the state, you would have to have a 12-point tilt from one party over to the other, 12-point victory from Democrats over Republicans for it to be 50-50. So, given that, the ability to be able to hold people accountable for not acting on a number of pieces of legislation, not doing the things that they should be doing, it becomes so incredibly difficult that the real election date is August 8th, which is the primary date, instead of November, when there would be a general election. So people end up fearing more of a primary instead of a general election, which is why you get pushes for the strange election, endless investigations that are happening we can talk about. Sure.
Does have 2/3 support, whatever, of both homes.
Yeah.
Whatever. I mean, I wish you would just come out and make that clear.
Yeah. I mean, there's.
And I wish you just come out and say whatever. Stop sending me junk bills.
Yeah, that would be nice. I mean, it's frustrating because there are things that we do need to be working on that we should be passing, but yeah, it's when the menu gets pre-selected of what actually gets on the floor, it gets pretty frustrating. So. Yeah, but I don't. Not only do I empathize with your frustration, I live it every day in the Senate. Yeah, because it's not a Yeah, because it's not a democracy. This is not a democracy of what we're living in right now. No, that's okay. Next slide. What do we have? So speaking of a lack of democracy, Fred Preen. So when we talked about the PFAS, the reason why they didn't move forward with the 20 parts per trillion is because Fred Preen has decided to squat in that seat. I think the slide says 11 months. It's over a year now, where he has kept himself in this DNR board chair, which rules on things like land sales and, in this case, on PFAS allowable contamination. And this is highly undemocratic. There's also Walker appointees refusing to leave the tech school board, which has huge impacts. And actually the number right now is over 100 different appointments that have not been filled. And so people continue to carry out terms 3.5 years after they should have been removed. So again, not representative democracy that we're living in Wisconsin. So what happened is after Evers won in 2018, there was a lame duck session. A lot of changes happened, including one that was just overruled. We'll get to that one. But one that has stayed on there is that a person can stay a lot longer in their positions, and they can stay until removed by the Senate or a new appointment comes in. It has also allowed the Senate to remove people. And if they are voted down, they cannot be reappointed. That has happened with our HH secretary, who has since moved on to be the deputy secretary of health for the entire country. But somebody was removed because they didn't like what she was doing around trying to prevent the spread of COVID. They said, we don't like that. This is bad. So they voted her down, which was absolutely ridiculous. You couldn't make it up. But yeah, so they have kept a lot of these spots open. And every once in a while there's enough pressure that some of them move along, but some of these are held open so people continue to sit in these seats regardless of how the election went.
So to be appointed, unless you approve it.
The governor appoints it and the Senate has to approve it. So the Senate has just not brought these up for a vote at all.
Well, the thing is that, again, which most citizens, whatever it is, can't get their hands around, whatever it is, again, I mean, is that if you have a new administration, whatever, if you have a new administration, what, again, like, you have like this green guy, all right, whatever, if the governor appoints somebody, the Senate should have to take it up, whatever, within 90 days, or whatever that magic number is, whatever, the Senate has to have a hearing.
Yeah.
Up and down vote.
Yep.
Whatever. Even if the vote, say the guy's voted down replacement, whatever, the existing person still has to leave his seat. The seat remains vacant until whatever.
Yeah. No, they're exploiting loopholes in the law that says until an appointment is named, and so they're saying, okay, you can end up staying in there. One of the other things that they passed in the lame duck period was the thing where it has supervision over rules. So that committee I mentioned at the beginning, Joint Committee for Review of Administrative Rules, that one meets usually to pass rules to suspend the enactment of laws or to suspend the actions of the administration. So they've done that repeatedly on a number of different issues. Where it actually cuts off the ability of the governor to be able to, in his administration, actually carry out the law, which is what the Constitution says they're supposed to do. But one of the victories that just came through was there was one of the lame duck pieces of legislation that passed was that the legislature would have oversight over settlements from lawsuits that the Attorney General would decide. And this had a huge impact because a lot of times if there's a settlement coming through, a settlement offer usually has an expiration of 24 hours. And so if the Attorney General can't make that decision or his office can't make that decision, they have to say, let's get the legislature together, let's see what they think. Like the expiration is already hit before they even have the opportunities, so therefore it hinders the ability to actually get settlements in case after case after case. And so the Attorney General sued and said this is a violation of the separation of powers. And that was just accepted last week. So unfortunately, it took 3 years to be able to get to that point. But this is a slew of different pieces of legislation that shifted power from the executive branch over to the legislative branch. And I have a spam call I need to get rid of, and it's done. Okay. Which is something we should be working on to try and get rid of more spam calls. Okay. So just to give you an idea of the number of bills that were enacted and authored, it gives you that number on the side there. What this looks like in real life too, and this is a real frustrating one, is folks who are hoping to protect Cedar Gorge on Lake Michigan. This is up in Sheboygan area. There's an anonymous legislator in the Senate who objected to the sale. And so because of that, the sale ended up falling apart. And that's the 8th time a member of the committee has held up a proposal anonymously, so we don't even know who did it. But this prevented the sale to a public group for public good, and basically makes it easier for a private land developer to be able to get it instead. That's a good question. It is something that was written into the law as an extension, or as a exception rather. And just to be clear, the state of Wisconsin has an exemption for open records for legislators writ large. So legislators don't have to keep our records, which is the governor does, the attorney general does, local officials here, we're in Oak Creek City Hall, all of the Oak Creek aldermen and all of the mayor, anything dealing with legislative, their legislative capacity, they have to keep those records. Legislators don't. We don't have to keep them. Immediately you can delete stuff. I wrote the bill, and I continue to write the bill and put it forward every year, every session I've been elected, to say this was ridiculous. We need to change this law. And I think a lot of it comes from, I came from a local elected position. I remember that, I was like, okay, we have to keep this, we have to keep this. And literally when I left, I took a big file paper, this is 2010, and took it over to the Corporation Council of Milwaukee County and said, hold on to this. These are, legal documents. If there's a record request, here they are. And I got to the state, and it was within like a month, maybe it was like 2 months, that I started getting notifications on my email that said, your inbox is full and you need to start deleting stuff. And my response was like, that must be a mistake. This must be like this be something where they set up the wrong account. And they were like, oh yeah, you just delete the stuff you don't want to keep around anymore. You should be deleting a lot of this stuff. I was like, but aren't you required by law? And they were like, oh no, no, legislators don't have to keep records. I was like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. So what's interesting is over time, every time a new class of legislators comes in, I try and talk to them about this, because they don't have that preconceived notion that they're like, they're special, that they don't have to keep records. They're like, yeah, it totally makes sense. We should keep this. So trying to get more and more people to sign on. But it hasn't gotten to that point where we've actually gotten it passed. But anyways, you ask why, is this a violation of open records? Absolutely, the spirit of it, but because they wrote an exemption that says that you can have anonymous objection from the Joint Finance Committee, it's legal. So that's what we're dealing with. You think? Yeah, I think you might be onto something. All right. Just a further idea. We already talked about the one on the right about the MIA soldiers, and that bill that was not just bipartisan, it was unanimous. That didn't pass because they didn't want to give the governor credit. The figure on the right, which may just sound like legalese, and your eyes may glaze over. It allows for, this is just an explanation for allowing a committee to vote by paper ballot. When you think of how democracy is supposed to work, a meeting of minds, a discussion of issues, a debate, moves of amendments, a discussion of those, and then the best possible bill moves forward, and there's opportunity for improvement of taking public ideas into consideration. Well, that has literally not happened at all in the last year and a half, specifically in the Education Committee. Every single one of the 12 times that we have voted on anything, it's been by something called paper ballot, which is, it's the equivalent of just like, it's a piece of paper comes to you, you vote yes or no, and that's it. You can't debate because there is nobody to debate with. You can talk to the piece of paper, but the paper's not going to respond. You can't propose amendments because nobody can see them unless you do it within the window beforehand. Somehow there's going to be a paper ballot. And it doesn't allow for any deliberation of things that were brought forward in the hearing. So that is the entirety of what happened to every education committee, and that is a practice that has increased dramatically over the last few years. So again, you talk about how are people getting paid to, if they're not going to work, this one literally you don't even have to be in the Capitol. You don't have to be there at all. So it's frustrating. And in the case of those bills that I talked about in the Education Committee, those were ones that I brought up in the hearing, and the chair, Alberta Darling, came back and said, well, this isn't a time for debate. This is a time to listen. We'll have time for debate later. And I said, we're going to have an executive session. We're going to actually debate these things. And she actually came out and said she was in favor of having the private schools also be covered by the so-called Parental Bill of Rights. They said, yeah, of course we're for that. So what ended up happening was, I think it was just 2 days later, not only did we not meet, the paper ballot came forward, no room for amendments. But we knew in advance that that might happen, so we submitted the amendment in advance, and of course she voted it down. So it didn't move forward. So we brought that up on the floor of the Senate, that this is a huge problem. But, you know, people are busy paying attention to other things, so people don't know this. But luckily you guys came out, you beat the rain, you find out about it here. This is what's going on, unfortunately, in our state capital. But not to just have bad news, here's some of the good things that happened. We have SB 3, which lowered prescription drug prices across Wisconsin. SB 62, raising pay for our underpaid public defenders. This is about 8 years, a little late, but still we're getting to pay parity with those that are assistant district attorneys. One that we, as Wisconsinites, can all get behind, Cocktails to Go, which it happened late in the pandemic. We introduced it right when the pandemic started, to be able to buy cocktails from restaurants and bars, to be able to take with you. We finally got that passed late. Expanding access to mental health care, which is something that is sorely needed. And then making sure that sexual assault kits no longer go untested, and people who endanger first responders on our roads are held accountable for that. So those are some of the things, some of the bipartisan things that end up passing. Yep.
What's an update to that sexual assault issue today? The Department of Justice launched the website where you can track the status if you are a victim of sexual assault. You can track the status of your particular kid.
Oh, nice. This is awesome. Did everybody hear that? So you can track them online at which website? DOJ?
Yeah, I'll get the website for you.
Okay.
The DOJ's website for that for you.
Thank you. This is Justin Belinsky. He works for me.
This is just a comment.
Yeah.
I worked for 5 years at 211.
Oh, yeah.
I was so happy to see about the new clinics for mental health opening up.
Yeah.
And some of the calls I got
Yep.
broke my heart.
Yep.
And so it was so wonderful to see that happening.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's huge. And a lot of that's regional that they were doing in Milwaukee County. But yes, it's sorely needed across the state. So, yeah, it's,
All over the state, 'cause we took this all over the state on weekends.
yep. Yeah.
And it was, I know up north, they had nothing. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for your work with that. 2-on-1s, it's huge. I remember taking a tour there back when I was a county supervisor, and it's just amazing. Yeah.
I don't know what we do without it.
Yeah. Does everybody know what 2-on-1 is? Do you know what to say what 2-on-1 is?
211 all you gotta do is dial 211. You get food pantries, you can get resources to help you pay your electric bill, or shelters, and sexual assault, and you name it, and crisis calls. I was 6
Yep.
years old when I started, and I said, oh, I'm a little old, I don't wanna take crisis calls, and they said, oh no, everybody learns crisis calls. And I took crisis calls, and then I'd hang up and the younger people would say to me, you had a man crying on you again, didn't you? And I,
Oh, no.
oh yeah, but it was 5 years of really wonderful work. A little tense, but really wonderful work.
Yeah.
Helping
Yeah.
people with things they needed, and the homeless men who would, or people who were, mentally ill.
Yeah.
Who just couldn't understand why they shouldn't be homeless,
Yeah.
and it would just make me feel so bad.
Yeah. Yeah. But 2-on-1 is the one stop
Oh,
for
it's
people to be able to
wonderful.
call and be able to get
Yes,
resources that they
it's
need. Yeah. Be connected.
If you need things, they're a good place to call for resources.
Yeah. So keep that number in mind if you or someone you know is in a situation, any of those that you described. So
Yeah.
that's something that needs more resources. But
It's wonderful.
yep, very much so.
24 hours a day.
Yeah, yeah. So we've reached the point where I'm at the end of slides. So we can talk about whatever you guys want, or anything else that we have covered, or anything you're seeing in the news, anything else related to the state. So if you came here with something on your mind, this is your chance. Yeah.
Regarding the expanded access to mental health care,
Yes.
does that include assistance for people who actually take advantage of that? Because I always hear whenever we talk about expanding access, like adding more beds or something.
Yeah.
Well, that's great that there's more capacity for
lot of it has, unfortunately, we live in a country where the level of health care that you get is dictated by private insurance, unless you fall below a certain income level, and then it's dictated by the public, or if you are over a certain age, then again, it's dictated by the government. And so in a lot of those cases, we've been pushing to try and expand Medicaid in this state to be able to increase the income eligibility for folks. A lot of folks fall underneath or fall in the range to be able to get mental health care covered. But unfortunately, we are one of the few states, I think we're one of 12 states that has still not expanded Medicaid, and so therefore the qualification is still much lower. I think it's at the level of poverty, which is about $17,000 annual for an individual. And so, yeah, it expands for those who are eligible. The legislation that passed is those who are eligible. Unfortunately, there is still not enough to meet the needs of those. Expanding Medicaid would end up doing more to make sure that there are more resources, and that boosts up. But yeah.
This mental health care act in the bill that we sponsored that was passed was the interjurisdictional compact. So any psychologist from another state who's part of the compact, which most states are now, could practice in Wisconsin and vice versa. So people live in rural areas where there's like no mental health providers, they could get telehealth services from a doctor, like say in Minnesota. Or if they wanted someone who spoke the language that they speak, they could get more. So basically, dramatically expanded the number of providers doing telehealth mental health care. So if you can afford it, that was not the issue. This was the issue of just being able to get it at all.
Yeah.
That was the bill that we were talking about.
Yeah. So there is still a blockade of being able to afford it, being insured, but yeah, being able to get to practice across state lines is something we passed, which is, it's good, it's getting there, but we're not in utopia yet. Does that answer your question? Okay. Hey, how's it going? Questions? Okay. Yep.
But I don't wanna, if somebody else has something to say, I'll let them talk about it.
Okay.
But anybody else? Possibly, yes.
Yeah.
Senator, I'm forest worker for Cyrus and Caterpillar, and I've worked on a lot of campaigns, so I'm just kind of getting geared up myself. My work goals, everything nobody thinks to do.
Sure.
Yeah, and so I'm just trying to get some more information about what's going on. So I appreciate meeting you again. I think the first time since I've ever ran into me, I was working for Jeff Clayton, which was such a bullshit thing. So
That was a while ago.
yeah, that was quite a while ago. Yeah. So trying to just to gear up a little bit for the people I still talk to at work. I retired.
Sure.
So,
Congrats.
and try to educate my fellow steelworkers, my brothers and sisters there.
Very good.
That's kind of why I'm here, and I'm still I know where I sit and everything like that, but I'm just trying to hear other people's questions and everything like that, trying to fill in some blanks of things that I'm not really sure of.
Sure.
Everybody's got surface knowledge of a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm trying to get a little more in-depth learning for gearing up for the fall.
Yeah, for sure. That's important. And that's it. Like, I think there's an assumption a lot of times that people know everything that's going on at the state, and I'll admit I don't know everything that's going on at the state. There's committees that go on, and I'm not able to follow everything. So I'm glad that you're here. But is there any questions and things that we covered where you want to dig a little bit deeper or want a little more info on?
Not really. Again, it's just getting a little more in-depth.
Sure.
Actually going to the meetings and see what's really going on.
Sure.
I've done, whenever I get Representative Rodriguez in my house during her lunch, just usually keep her there as long as I can, so she can't talk to me.
Well, we can't, I'm going to stop you there because we can't talk about election stuff here because this is a state function. I will say that one of the things that I'd encourage you to do, and you've probably already done this, is sign up for our email newsletter. So if you haven't, and this goes for everybody, putting your email on the list outside We can send only a limited number of communications between now and the election because we're in election season. There's something called the Rule of 50, which means you can't distribute anything over the number 50. So, which is why usually you'll come to these and you'll have roadmaps. We can get you a roadmap. We just can't give you one. We have to have somebody else send it from the state. Blue books, if you know what blue books are, usually have a stack of those. We don't have those. And then our email newsletter, which I know a lot of folks get. After April 15th, we can't send out any of those things, but if you sign up, as soon as we are able to do that again, we'll start sending those out to make sure people are informed about what's going on. So, but I will say in the meantime, you can check out what's happening on Facebook, our Facebook page, our Twitter page, which we keep a very good job of updating. And on top of that, we do have our former newsletters, our past newsletters in the archive on the website, senatorchrislarson.com. Okay, good. Yeah, and then also if you have questions, we've got Justin Blinsky who does handle a lot of our communications, who puts all those things together, and Nick Janis who are here from my office. So if you call, that's always an easy way too. So you don't have to compose anything formal to try and ask a question about things. So we're happy to try and help. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this is more of a national issue, but it will eventually probably trickle down to the state level. This has to do with tuition forgiveness, student loan debt forgiveness.
Yeah.
I take the opinion, whatever, and I think a lot of people share this opinion, whatever, is that people are open to the idea,
Sure.
whatever, of student debt tuition forgiveness. But there has to be a payback. Whatever, what I always say, whatever, is that the payback can be like a reverse GI Bill type program. Serve the National Guard for 6 years, whatever, you get X number of dollars, whatever, kind of like if you, the traditional GI Bill program. There are volunteer fire departments and EMS services across the state, whatever, that can't, whatever, staff up anymore.
Yeah.
Whatever, serve your local community on as the volunteer fire department for X number of years, and you get $10,000 written off. I mean, there's tons of ideas.
Yeah, it's an
on how
interesting.
it could be implemented,
Yeah.
whatever, but I mean, but everybody's looking at it, whatever, as one extreme to the other, whatever, and it's like, I mean, you can even go into being you can even go into whatever, being a teacher, whatever, in an inner city environment or a rural environment, whatever, where there's shortages, whatever, right? Be a
Yeah.
teacher, whatever, in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, or whatever, for 6 years, and
Yeah.
20,000 is forgiven.
I would say it's an interesting idea. I appreciate you being open and honest with your thoughts on it. I would say I think that was that could have been something that was could have been implemented maybe 10 years ago, but we've gotten to the point right now where it is having a scarring effect on our society writ large. So there's kids who are not only not able to get married, they're not able to buy cars, they're not able to buy their first house, and they're not able to have kids, to the point where now we are seeing our birth rates plummet, and people are not having that because they are mounted with school debt. So the cost of tuition, when I started college, I could pay and work at the same time, which I thought was pretty awesome, and I did it. But then what ended up happening was the laws changed so that student debt was not something that could be extinguished by declaring bankruptcy. And through that and through other reasons, the cost of tuition has since skyrocketed. So it was about $1,700 per semester when I first started, way back in 1999. And by the time I graduated years later, it was more than double that per semester. And what was interesting is the student loan folks were more than happy to give the money to me with a signature, because it was guaranteed. It was guaranteed funds. The amount of tuition has again doubled since then, so it is sky high. So students who are graduating with huge mountains of debt, unable to be able to find work, and if they're able to find work, they're not able to pay this stuff back. And that is having an impact where, especially having the recession of 2008, 2009, and of course what happened in the pandemic, a lot of these students aren't, these graduates are not able to find work. And one of the more interesting things is 40% of debt holders don't have a degree. So they were going along, they were getting their degree, they were mounting up debt, and at some point they realized, either through life circumstances or through just doing the simple math of realizing it's not worth it, because they're coming up with all of this debt, seeing their friends graduating and realizing, well, they're not actually, that promise that may have been for the last generation that you know, this is an investment in yourself, it pays for itself, you get higher wages. They realize that's boo-hucky, because they could just make just as much by not finishing the degree and getting a job. And so that has left an entire generation of students, in some cases, you know, 5 figures at least, some cases 6 figures, unable to advance in their lives, either starting a business, starting a family, you know, whatever. So I think this is a huge, huge problem, where right now college debt is only surpassed by credit card debt, which is kind of bonkers, right? And so if there's not something done to alleviate this, it is going to continue to hold back a generation. Now, you know, what does that mean? If you hear all that and you say, well, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me, what that means as a society is that these people feel like they're not part of the social contract. They're saying, okay, I thought that I was going to go to school, get a degree, and I would be able to get a job, and if they're not feeling a part of that, you know, they don't feel like they're part of this society, they're not looking after each other, and you know, it's how we end up having with higher crime and other issues, because people feel like they're not part of the community. Right, right.
I mean, because where I have the issue, whatever, is that, again, you take, I'll just use a generic example. You have a kid from Wisconsin who, whatever, wants to go to some school in California.
Sure.
Whatever, and goes out there, whatever, pays out of state tuition, whatever runs up student debt, whatever, and then now the expectation is that all that debt that person would have made by going out to
Yeah.
California to get an English degree, whatever, and due to whatever circumstances, whatever, now will be forgiven. I mean, I just have a problem with, I mean, because I went to UW Whitewater,
Yeah.
whatever, because basically my dad said, whatever, this is what we can afford.
Yeah.
Whatever,
And I get,
get a
yeah.
degree from UW.
And I get some people, yeah, and I get some of that is it becomes a, well, I did it, so therefore others should. But the reality of the circumstances of where things are right now, there might be a case or two that are out there like that, but the reality is it's mostly it's not. Mostly it's students who they were trying to get a degree, trying to advance themselves, and then they said, okay, I'm not going to continue to pile on debt that I will never be able to pay back. So yeah, that's where it is. I mean, if it were the way that we should be shifting is, I mean, we don't charge for education. If it is for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, all the way up to high school. And why was that? We said, okay, we want to make sure everyone has a basic level of understanding of the world around them. We want to make sure that everyone has access to this. And it was part of like the core of our democracy as a country to be able to say, to having a good, robust democracy is making sure that everyone has access to an education, not just the elites, not just the people who can afford